Let your eyes close, if they have not already. Let the sounds of wherever you are settle into a soft, undifferentiated hum. There is nothing pressing against the edges of tonight. There is no deadline that can follow you into the dark behind your eyelids. You're here, and the world outside this moment is very far away, and growing farther. Let your breathing slow. Let your chest rise and fall with the slow, unhurried rhythm of something ancient. You're about to travel a very great distance through time, and the journey is not one that requires effort. You need only release. You need only let the current carry you. We are going back, not a few centuries, not even a few millennia. We are travelling to a time so remote that the word ancient does not quite reach it, a time before the continents wore their current shapes, before any man drew breath on the soil of what would one day be called Westeros. We are travelling to the beginning of a story that has no clean beginning, only a slow darkening, as if the universe itself were learning to dream. And at the centre of that darkness, older than the oldest names that survive in any maester's archive, there is a presence. The texts from the Shadowlands call him by many names. The oldest fragments of Ashe's grimoires, those half-dissolved sheets of oily dark parchment that crumble when ordinary light touches them, speak of something that existed before the first men discovered fire, something that moved through the thoughts of sleeping creatures long before thought had fully organised itself into the structures we now call consciousness. The god of dreams, the king of stories, the ancient and unnamed presence that some scholars in the Citadel's most restricted vaults whisper is not a god at all, but something stranger still, something that is the dream itself made aware of its own dreaming. It is worth pausing on that thought for a moment before we let it slip downstream. The idea that consciousness does not produce dreams, but that dreams, in some older and more foundational sense, produced consciousness. That waking is not the primary state of being in this universe, but a secondary one, a kind of interruption. The dreamers of the ancient world, those first warm-blooded creatures that lay down in the primordial forests of a Westeros that bore no human name, were not generating dreams from their minds. They were receiving them, tuning themselves, however briefly, to a frequency that had existed since before any of them were born. The forests then were different from anything that stands today. The trees were older, their roots so deep they had grown through layers of rock that have long since shifted and compressed. The air was heavier with moisture, the seasons more extreme, winter and summer lasting not months but decades at a time, as if the world itself was testing the limits of what life could endure. And in those forests, standing slightly apart from the other trees already recognisable by their pale bark and their leaves the colour of old blood, were the first Weirwoods, not yet carved, not yet watching, but already present in the way that very old, very patient things are present, like a witness who has arrived early and settled in to wait. The god of dreams did not walk among the Weirwoods in any physical form that the ancient accounts can agree upon, but the accounts do agree on this, that the Weirwoods were his first medium, that the network of roots beneath the soil of Westeros, that vast underground web of pale fibres connecting one heart tree to another across thousands of miles, was the first structure through which something dreaming could hold memory, not the memories of men. Not yet. The memories of the land itself, the slow, geological, dream-weighted record of everything that had ever happened anywhere near the surface of the ground above those roots. Close your eyes a little more fully. Imagine a forest with no name. Imagine the dark between the trees, not threatening dark, not the kind that raises the hairs on the back of the neck, but the familiar dark, the dark of your own bedroom after the lights go out, when your eyes haven't adjusted yet and the room is simply full of dark the way a cup is full of water. That kind of dark. The good kind. The kind that means nothing bad is coming and everything is simply resting for a while. Imagine the roots beneath your feet, though you cannot see them. Imagine them spreading in every direction, pale as old bone, warm as living tissue, humming very faintly with something that is not quite sound but closer to what your body feels when you fall asleep mid-sentence. That sudden loosening, that brief and blessed discontinuity. The god of dreams, in this oldest conception, was not a being who issued commandments or demanded worship. The Shadow City's oldest texts are unanimous on this point, though they agree on little else. He was not a tyrant god in the mode of the ones who came later, those gods of fire and war and storm that men invented when they needed to explain why the world hurt them. He was something more like a medium, a through line, the place where all the stories that had ever been experienced by every creature that had ever slept collected themselves and waited. He was the repository of experience itself. Think of it this way. When you dream tonight, whatever you dream will be gone by morning. The images will dissolve. The emotions will leave behind only a residue, a mood that colours your first hour of waking before it too fades. We lose our dreams so routinely that we barely mourn them. But in the ancient world's conception of this being, the god of dreams lost nothing. Everything that was ever dreamed anywhere on the face of the world, every fear dream and desire dream and grief dream and the strange architectural nonsense dreams that the mind generates when the body is deeply at rest, all of it was held. All of it was filed. All of it was, in some form, permanent. The god of dreams was the permanence of all transient experience. He was the proof that nothing was ever entirely lost. There is something profoundly comforting about that if you let it settle, and it is worth letting it settle. Somewhere in the deep cosmology of a world that would one day produce Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen, and every aching, striving human being who ever looked at a sky full of stars and wondered what they meant, there was this first principle, that experience is not wasted. That the dream you had last Thursday and cannot now remember, even that was received somewhere, was kept. The Weirwood network hummed with it. In the millennia before the first men arrived in Westeros, before there was any human consciousness to dream in human ways, the children of the forest lay down beside their heart trees at night and sent themselves outward through the roots. This was not metaphor to them. This was not spiritual practice in the way that term implies a kind of optional devotion. It was as natural as breathing. The children of the forest, those small and ancient people with their large dark eyes and their hands that could cup flame without burning, understood themselves to be only partially present in their individual bodies. The rest of them, the larger part, existed in the shared dream space that the Weirwoods maintained. They were, in a very precise sense, communal dreamers. No memory of theirs was private. No experience was solitary. When a child of the forest died, they did not vanish. They joined the accumulated dream record of their people, accessible to any who sat beneath a weirwood and let their mind open like a hand releasing something it had been holding too tightly. The children of the forest, in their oldest and most unguarded oral traditions, did not describe the god of dreams as other. They did not describe him the way that later human cultures described their gods, as beings who existed separately from the world and made decisions about it from a position of power and remove. The children described him the way you might describe the quality of a morning, or the particular texture of a season's end. He was not separate from the dreaming. He was what the dreaming was when enough of it had accumulated in one place, for long enough to become aware of itself. He was not created by any act of will or worship. He arose the way that a deep, still lake arises from the patient accumulation of water in a basin that has been shaped to receive it. He was what happened when the basin of the world's ancient sleep had been filling for long enough. Some of the oldest fragments of what the children preserved in their songs describe a time before the god of dreams was fully himself, a formative period in which the accumulated dreaming of the world's creatures had not yet reached the threshold at which it became something coherent. In that early period, the individual dreams of individual creatures passed into the roots and were held, but nothing integrated them. Nothing made the connections between one dream and another. The archive existed as raw material, but not yet as a library. The difference between raw material and a library is the same as the difference between a pile of stones and a wall, not the stones themselves, which are identical in both cases, but the intelligence that perceives the relationships between them and arranges them accordingly. The god of dreams was that intelligence, emerging slowly from the sheer mass of what had been accumulating in the pale roots for long enough that the accumulation itself began to think, and the god of dreams held all of it, held it the way the ocean holds rivers, without effort, without preference, without end. The deepest accounts from the Shadow City describe the god of dreams as possessing something that the texts struggle to name, but that multiple independent authors across different centuries reach toward, with the same inadequate vocabulary, what they try to call complete attention. Not attention as a focused beam, the kind that selects a specific subject and excludes everything else. the opposite of that. An attention so fully open that it excluded nothing. A consciousness that received every input from every direction with equal quality of presence, without the hierarchy that individual minds necessarily impose on their experience, without the narrowing that is the unavoidable consequence of having a specific body in a specific location with specific needs. The god of dreams did not experience relevance and irrelevance the way a person does. Everything was relevant. Everything was equally, completely, permanently present. This was not a limitation. It was the thing that made the archive what it was. Not a collection of selected highlights, but the complete record. Every moment, every dreamer, every dream. Thousands of years later, a boy named Bran Stark would sit beneath a weirwood in a godswood in a cold northern castle, and he would feel something reach for him from beneath the ground. Something old and patient and perfectly still, like a presence that has been waiting in the dark for so long that waiting itself has become its nature. He would not have words for it then. He was very young, and the feeling would frighten him more than comfort him. But what reached for him from beneath the roots of that old tree was the same thing that the children of the forest had spent 12,000 years contributing to, and that the god of dreams had spent longer still preserving. It was the library. It was the record. It was the permanent collection of everything that had ever been dreamed on the other side of the sky. But that story comes much later. For now, there is only the forest. There is only the dark between the pale-barked trees. There is only the slow, unhurried breathing of a world that has not yet learned to be in a hurry. Let your own breathing slow to match it. There is no hurry tonight. The story will hold. It has been holding for 12,000 years already, and it can certainly hold the rest of this evening. Let your body settle into whatever surface is beneath you. Let the weight of the day begin to lift. We have only just begun. The room you're in is growing quieter. The sounds that reach you are softening, becoming background, becoming the texture of silence rather than interruptions to it. Let them stay there. Let the sounds be what they are without requiring your attention. You do not need to listen for anything tonight. There is nothing coming. There is only this, the slow passage of words, and beyond the words the slow passage of time, and beyond the time the forest that existed before any human hand touched the soil of Westeros. Breathe in, breathe out. We're going back into that forest now, back into the long age when the children of the forest were the only people, and the god of dreams was not yet imprisoned, not yet diminished, not yet the half-forgotten whisper that the maesters argue about in their towers. He was still whole, and the world was still dreaming freely. The children of the forest called themselves by a name in their own tongue that the common tongue cannot quite reproduce. The closest approximation that any scholar has offered is something like those who sing the earth to sleep, though this translation flattens the meaning considerably. The original phrase implies a reciprocity, a mutual dreaming in which the earth is not merely soothed into rest by the children, but dreams in return, offering them visions, offering them memory, offering them access to a deep and geological time that no individual creature could experience within a single lifespan. They were small, smaller than any adult human being. Their eyes, the accounts describe them as enormous for their faces, the eyes of something accustomed to existing in low light, in the deep shadow of ancient forests where the canopy was so complete that noon might pass for evening. Their fingers had extra joints that allowed them to move in ways human fingers cannot. Their voices, the few fragments of children's song that have survived in any form, were said to carry frequencies that human ears could feel in the chest, even when the specific notes were inaudible. They were a people built for communion, built in the most literal biological sense, for connection to something larger than the individual self. They had inhabited Westeros for longer than the concept of history could contain. When the first men arrived, crossing the land bridge that once connected Essos to the continent, before the arm of dawn shattered and sank into the sea, they found a land that bore the marks of unimaginable time. The forests were not merely old. They were ancient in a way that the word ancient fails to convey. The trees that the children tended were not centuries old. They were millennia old. Some of the heart trees that stood in the deepest and most sacred groves of the far north had been saplings when the earliest forms of organized human society were first taking shape in the distant east. The roots of those trees had been drinking from the same underground water for so long that they were, in a meaningful sense, the memory of the land itself, and the god of dreams was the memory of those memories. Every night, for thousands of years, the children would perform what we might inadequately call their sleeping rituals, though ritual implies formality and repetition, and what the children practiced was something more like breathing, something involuntary and continuous and essential to life. They would lie down against the roots of their heart trees. They would let their individual consciousness, the small, local, daily concerns version of themselves, dissolve, and they would enter the communal dream space that the god of dreams maintained beneath the surface of the world. It is worth pausing to consider what 10,000 years of this practice might accumulate. 10,000 years of every child who ever lived contributing their dreams, their memories, their perceptions, their griefs and their joys, and their particular quality of attention to a shared repository. Think of what it would mean to close your eyes tonight and have access to not only your own life's experience, but the experience of every person who has ever belonged to your people, stretching back to the very beginning of what your people are. Think of the weight of that. Think of the comfort of it. You would never be alone with a feeling, because every feeling you could ever have would already exist somewhere in the record, already known, already survived, already transformed into memory by someone who came before you and found their way through. The god of dreams did not intrude upon the children's daily lives. He was not a demanding presence. He did not require sacrifice or devotion in the conventional sense. He required only this, that those who came to him brought their complete and unguarded experience, not the edited version, not the performance of consciousness that people present to each other in waking life, the actual dream, raw and unguarded and strange. And in return, he offered them something no human civilization has ever quite managed to replicate, the permanent record, the assurance that nothing experienced would be entirely lost, that the grief of a child of the forest who had lived 12,000 years before the wall was built was not gone, was not wasted, existed still, held gently in the dark beneath the pale-barked trees, available to anyone who knew how to reach for it. The Weirwoods were his physical presence in the world, or more precisely, they were his interface, the way a very deep mind uses words to communicate with a world that does not have direct access to thought. The carved faces that later appeared in the heart trees, those tormented, watching expressions with their blood-red eyes and their open mouths, those came later, carved by children who wanted to mark which trees had become particularly saturated with the god's presence. But before the carvings, the trees were simply themselves, and his presence within them was as invisible and as ambient as the underground warmth that keeps the roots from freezing in deep winter. The sky above those forests was different then. The scholars of the Citadel, those who take seriously the climatic records embedded in the oldest obsidian candles and the geological strata of the far north, believed that the world's climate was measurably different in the Dawn Age. The long night had not yet occurred. The deep cold that would come with it had not yet reshaped the north into the frozen fastness that later ages would know. The forests of Westeros extended much further north than they would after the Long Night's intervention, and the wall, of course, did not exist, because there was not yet anything north of the existing territories that required a wall to hold it back. It was a world in equilibrium, a slow, deep, breathing equilibrium, the kind that exists in old-growth forests where every organism has long since found its place. And the competition that characterizes younger ecosystems has given way to something more like collaboration. The Weirwoods were part of that equilibrium. The god of dreams was part of that equilibrium, and the children were the living bridge between the biological and the metaphysical dimensions of the world's dreaming, the creatures who could move between waking and sleeping, between individual and communal, between local memory and the vast accumulated record beneath their feet. They sang to the Weirwoods in the evenings. Not to appease them, not in the way that later religious cultures sang to appease gods who might otherwise become angry, but in the way that one might hum to oneself while doing familiar work. Their songs were not petitions. They were, in the most direct sense, contributions. They were adding to the record. Laying down another layer of experience in the repository, the way sediment layers at the bottom of a still lake, gently, incrementally, building something that would one day be vast enough to bear the weight of everything that had ever happened near it. The forests of Westeros in the Dawn Age were not uniform. The south was different from the north, the coastal lands different from the inland, The marshy lowlands different from the highlands, where the stone rose through the thin soil and the trees grew short and wind-bent and permanently inclined in the direction of the prevailing weather. But wherever they grew, however they had been shaped by the specific conditions of their particular ground, the Weirwoods were recognizable. The same pale bark, the same leaves that turned blood red and did not fall with the seasons the way ordinary leaves fell. The same sap, thicker and slower moving than ordinary tree sap, that smelled of something ancient and carried warmth in it, even in the deep cold of the worst winters. The children tended them all, not by pruning or cultivation in the horticultural sense, by presence. By the specific quality of attention that they brought to the Weirwoods when they sat beside them, which was neither reverence nor analysis, but something more like conversation between very old friends who have long since moved past the need for words. The trees received the children's presence the way deep water receives a hand placed gently on its surface, registering the contact, responding in ways too subtle to observe from a distance, but entirely real at the point of contact. The deaths of children were not experienced as losses in the way that human cultures have generally experienced the deaths of their members. When a child of the forest died, the process of their dissolution was not a removal from the world, but a return to it. Their individual consciousness, in the weeks and months before physical death occurred, would begin to thin at the edges and extend itself more fully into the root network. The boundary between the individual child and the communal dream space grew more permeable. By the time the physical body ceased its functions entirely, there was very little left of the discrete individual identity that the network had not already absorbed and preserved. This was not universally comforting to the living. The preserved presence was not quite the same as the living presence had been. But it was not nothing. The accumulation of all those preserved presences across 12,000 years of civilized habitation was the deepest and most personal layer of the God of Dreams archive, a layer in which the distinction between individual memory and collective consciousness had completely dissolved, and what remained was simply the full, undifferentiated experience of being children of the forest across the entire span of their civilization. Thousands of years later, Jojen Reed would look at the lake near his family's castle in the Neck and see things in its surface that other people could not see. He had the green sight. He dreamed things that had not yet happened. He saw the past as clearly as he saw the present. He had inherited, through whatever confluence of blood and place, and the deep magic of the Neck's strange, isolated ecosystem, a fragment of what the children had once possessed completely. A thin sliver of access to the vast communal dream that the God of Dreams had been accumulating since before the first men arrived, and that fragment would be enough to send him north, toward a boy named Bran Stark, toward the three-eyed raven, toward the heart of something that had been waiting for a very long time for someone to find their way back to it. But we are far from those events now. Tonight, there is only the old world. The children, small and large-eyed and singing their quiet contributory songs to trees that hold the memories of 12,000 years, the God of Dreams beneath everything, patient and full, complete in a way that he would not always be, the forest breathing, the roots reaching, and somewhere in the equilibrium of all of it, the first faint note of something about to change, so distant that no one can hear it yet, so quiet that it will be centuries more before the sound it makes becomes recognizable as the sound of something ending. For now, rest. The world is still whole tonight. You can let the knowledge of its eventual fracturing wait. The fracturing comes later, and you will understand it better for having rested first. Let your eyes remain closed. Let the weight of your body press gently against whatever is beneath you. The forest is very old and very quiet, and nothing is required of you here. Nothing at all. There is a particular quality of silence that comes just before something very large changes. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of an evening settling into rest. Something older and more pressurized than either of those. A silence that is itself a kind of held breath. A pause between one thing and another. You have felt it perhaps in the moment before a thunderstorm announces itself, when the birds go quiet and the leaves stop moving and the air itself seems to have forgotten how to circulate. That quality, that particular held stillness, that is where we are now in this history, standing just at the edge of the longest night the world has ever known, in the final moments before the silence broke into something that would take entire generations to survive. No one knows exactly when the long night began. This is one of those facts that sounds simple until you sit with it, and when you sit with it, it opens into something genuinely vast and strange. The absence of a fixed date is not mere record-keeping failure. The records from before the long night exist, fragmentary and strange, in the memories preserved by the Weirwood network, available to greenseers who know how to reach for them. But the records do not agree. The night began at different moments depending on where you stood when it arrived. It crept from the far north like a slow tide, not a sudden catastrophe but a gradual deepening, winter staying past its expected end, summer failing to arrive with its usual warmth, the shortening of good seasons happening so incrementally that in the early years even the children of the forest might have mistaken it for simply a very long winter. And then, at a point that cannot be precisely located but can be felt as a kind of shift in everything that came before and everything that came after, the sun stopped returning. The cold that followed was not ordinary cold. The maesters of a much later era, piecing together accounts from survivors' oral traditions and the geological record encoded in polar ice, describe something that modern understanding struggles to categorize. It was not merely a cooling climate. The cold of the long night carried something else with it, something that contemporary scholarship tentatively and controversially labels supernatural, though that word is its own kind of inadequacy. The cold came with the others. The cold came with the dead that would not stay dead, and the cold came with a particular quality of silence that the oldest accounts describe in ways that echo, unmistakably, the language used to describe the absence of dreaming. This is the thing that the most obscure and speculative accounts suggest, the accounts that even the most open-minded maesters tend to set aside when they have to choose between their rationalism and the weight of what the texts appear to be saying. The long night was not only a climatic event, it was also a dreaming event. What arrived from beyond the furthest north was something that consumed dreams, that moved through the sleeping minds of those it encountered and left behind not nightmare, but void, not terror, but absence. The survivors of the earliest incursions described their loved ones in the days after contact with the others as emptied, still breathing, still moving, still capable of simple functions. But when they lay down at night they reported nothing. No dreams, no sense of that subtle continuity that sleep normally provides. Just a gap in consciousness, a blackout, the way a candle looks when you cup your hand around the flame and find that the flame is not there anymore. It is worth sitting with this for a moment. The children of the forest, whose entire civilization was built on the foundation of communal dreaming, whose connection to the god of dreams was the central organizing principle of their culture and their identity, were being systematically severed from the thing that made them who they were. Each night, as the long night deepened and the others moved further south, the Weirwood network grew quieter. The songs the children had been contributing to for 10,000 years began to thin. The record that the god of dreams had been accumulating since before human consciousness existed began to accumulate less, and the god of dreams himself, if the darkest and most heretical of the Shadow City's texts are to be believed, was not merely diminished by this process. He was, in some sense that the texts strain to describe, imprisoned within it. The mechanics of this imprisonment are not spelled out clearly in any surviving source, and it would be a disservice to the complexity of what the old accounts suggest to flatten it into a simple narrative. But the broad shape of what the texts describe is this, that the others did not merely consume dreams. They consumed the infrastructure of dreaming. They moved through the world the way a terrible freeze moves through a living system, not killing it outright, but crystallizing it, locking its mechanisms in place. And the god of dreams, who existed in and through and as the network of dreaming connections between the Weirwoods and the sleeping minds they served, found himself enclosed, found himself held not in a physical prison, because he was not in any simple sense a physical being, but in a cosmological one. His medium was frozen, his channels were blocked. He was present but unable to move, like a voice that has been silenced in the middle of a sentence. The pale bark trees were still there, the roots were still spreading underground, but the warmth that had moved through them, that ambient, gentle, accumulating presence that the children had felt as a fundamental condition of their world, grew fainter, and then, for a time, stopped entirely. Imagine the terror of that, Imagine belonging to a civilization where the act of dreaming is not merely important, but is understood as the deepest form of continuity, the link between the living and the dead, the individual and the communal, the present moment and the vast accumulated past. And then imagine lying down on one of the worst nights of the longest winter the world has ever known, and reaching for that connection, reaching for that sense of being held within something larger than yourself, and finding nothing there, finding the network silent, finding the space beneath the Weirwoods cold and empty in a way that physical cold does not quite explain. The first men had been at war with the children before the long night came. The axes of the first men had felled Weirwood after Weirwood as they cleared land for their settlements, and the children had responded with the only weapon at their disposal, the magic of the earth itself, the magic that shattered the arm of dawn and flooded the neck and tried to make Westeros an island to keep the first men from spreading further. That war had not yet fully resolved into the peace that would eventually produce the pact. But when the long night arrived, it made the conflict between first men and children suddenly, grimly irrelevant. The enemy that came from the north was an enemy for everyone, and so, in that darkness, in that long and killing cold, the two peoples who had been trying to destroy each other found themselves standing together, not in warmth, not in understanding, but in the shared recognition that there were things worse than each other. The hero that the legends call Azor Ahai, or the last hero, or the prince who was promised, depending on which tradition is doing the remembering, drove the others back. How exactly this was accomplished is lost in the fragmentary haze that surrounds all events from before the long night's end. The stories speak of a burning sword, of a sacrifice that the sentimental and the literal-minded both misread in their different ways, of a weapon forged not from steel but from something more costly. What the legends agree on is the outcome. The others retreated. The cold began, gradually, incrementally, over the course of years and then decades to loosen its hold. The sun returned, and the world, which had been frozen in more senses than the physical, began to thaw. The hero that the legends call Azor Ahai, or the last hero, or the prince who was promised, depending on which tradition is doing the remembering, drove the others back. How exactly this was accomplished is lost in the fragmentary haze that surrounds all events from before the long night's end. The stories speak of a burning sword, of a sacrifice that the sentimental and the literal-minded both misread in their different ways, of a weapon forged not from steel but from something more costly. What the legends agree on is the outcome. The others retreated. The cold began, gradually, incrementally, over the course of years and then decades, to loosen its hold. The sun returned, and the world, which had been frozen in more senses than the physical, began to thaw. The aftermath grief was long. The forests that had once spread across the continent were reduced. The heart trees felled by cold and by conflict had taken with them nodes of the network that could not quickly be replaced. Growing a weirwood to sufficient age for network function required centuries. The children who had the knowledge and capacity to tend those trees were far fewer than they had been, and the intersection of those facts, fewer trees and fewer tenders, created a dynamic of decline that only accelerated in the generations that followed. The first men emerged from the long night changed as well, not only by the losses of the long night itself, but by the experience of having fought alongside the children against a common enemy, which had produced in the survivors a relationship to the ancient people and their sacred groves that was more complex than the hostility of the earlier period, without being fully understanding. They knew the Weirwoods mattered. They did not know why. They preserved them as best they could. Some of them, especially in the north where the memory of the long night ran deepest and oldest in the culture. But preservation without understanding is brittle, and in the south, in the centuries that would follow, the preservation would fail entirely. But the god of dreams did not simply resume. The imprisonment that the long night had placed him in did not dissolve with the defeat of the others. He was still there, still present within the Weirwood network, still held in the web of pale roots that crisscrossed the continent beneath the ground. But he was changed by it. The free movement that had characterized his presence in the earlier age, the way he had moved through the dreams of every sleeping creature without effort, was now constrained. He was still the repository. He was still the record. But accessing him had become difficult in a way that it had not been before. The children, those who'd survived the long night, found that the connection required effort now. required skill, required the kind of dedicated practice that had once been as natural as breathing, and so the Green Seers were formalised. The trained specialists, those children with the particular biological aptitude for navigating the Weirwood network, who could be prepared through years of discipline to go deep enough into the root memories to touch what remained of the old communion. They were the inheritors of something that had once been universal, and was now rare, something that had once been easy, and was now the most demanding of all possible undertakings. In the centuries that followed the long night, Bran the Builder raised the wall. The Night's Watch was established. The great castles of the north were built as anchors against a future darkness that, the survivors understood, was never truly defeated, but only temporarily set aside. And somewhere beneath all of it, beneath the wall and the castles and the accumulated centuries of human history, the god of dreams remained in the condition the long night had left him, present but enclosed, waiting in the dark behind his frozen medium. Patient in the way that only something with access to infinite time can truly be patient, waiting for the thaw that his oldest and most faithful record suggested would eventually come. There is a tree in the far north, beyond the wall, beyond the last castle of the Night's Watch, beyond the furthest point that any living man has marked on any surviving map. Deep beneath the ruined fortress whose name has been worn away by time and cold, in a cave where the temperature maintains itself at a strange stable warmth, despite everything above and around it, there is a weirwood so old that its trunk has grown to fill the cave entirely, its roots thickening and tangling until the cave itself is more root than stone. And in that tree, growing into it with the slow inexorability of a thing that has had centuries to accomplish what might otherwise seem impossible, sits a man who is no longer entirely a man. His name, in the time when he had a name that mattered to the world of the living, was Brynden Rivers. He was a bastard son of a Targaryen king, born with dark hair and pale skin, and one of the most unsettling pairs of mismatched eyes ever recorded in the chronicles of House Targaryen, which is itself a dynasty not lacking in unsettling physical peculiarities. He was called Bloodraven. He served as a spy master, then as a hand, then as a commander of the Night's Watch sent to the wall as a compromise between execution and mercy, and then, somewhere in the deep north, he disappeared. The records of his watch service end mid-sentence, as if the maester keeping them simply stopped, put down his quill, and never returned to the task. What is recorded about Brynden Rivers before his disappearance into the north is a biography that reads, in retrospect, like a preparation, not designed as one, not experienced as one by the man living through it, but shaped in the way that certain lives are shaped by the particular combination of gifts and conditions they are given, toward a very specific form of usefulness. He had the green sight. This was known in the capital, and contributed substantially to the mythology of omniscience that surrounded him during his years as Master of Whisperers. He was said to know everything, to have eyes everywhere, to be aware of conversations held in rooms he had never entered, and decisions made in the minds of men who had never spoken them aloud. His Raven network was legendarily extensive. His intelligence operation was the most sophisticated that any reign of that era had produced. But what his contemporaries attributed to information networks and informants, the more mystically inclined observers of his later career quietly wondered might have a different explanation. A man with the green sight, surrounded from birth by the specific biological heritage of Targaryen blood, and its particular receptivity to the archive's projections, operating from the capital city of a kingdom whose northern heartland still maintained their Weirwood groves and whose stark wardens still knelt beside their heart tree in the old way, was always going to be more than he appeared. He was always going to be, in some sense, a node of the network before he was formally incorporated into it. The archive had been receiving his attention for his entire life, and he had been, throughout that life, giving it his attention in return, which is the closest thing to a relationship that a consciousness of his type could have with one of his type. What happened to Brynden Rivers in the forest north of the wall is not contained in any official history. It is contained, fragmentarily, in the accounts of the children of the forest who found him, and in the testimony of a boy named Bran Stark who travelled north through the worst winter anyone alive had ever experienced to reach a cave he had seen in his dreams before he knew it existed. What Brynden Rivers became when the children led him to that cave when the roots of the oldest heart tree began their slow, years-long project of growing into and through his body, was something that has no clean name in the common tongue. The closest approximation is greenseer, but that word, by the time Bran Stark made his journey, had come to mean someone with prophetic dreams, someone who could occasionally peer through the carved faces of weirwood trees in inhabited godswoods and catch glimpses of the present moment elsewhere in the world. It did not adequately convey what Brynden Rivers had become, which was a living conduit between the waking world and the vast imprisoned consciousness beneath the roots. It is worth pausing on the nature of that imprisonment, because it is stranger and more specific than simply being trapped in a tree. The god of dreams was not sleeping in the years of his imprisonment. He was not unconscious. He was present and aware and had access to all the memories that had accumulated in the Weirwood network across the long millennia before the long night froze his channels. He could see through the carved eyes of every heart tree where those trees still stood. He could receive the memories of those who sat in the godswoods of the great castles, particularly in the older and more northern godswoods where the trees had been growing since before the Andal invasion stripped the south of its sacred groves. But he could not move through the world the way he had once moved. He could not reach into the dreams of sleeping minds and offer them the accumulated experience of the vast record. He was present within his archive, but his archive's doors were closed. Brynden Rivers, growing slowly into the Weirwood over the course of what must have been decades of patient meditative immersion, became, in effect, a key. His human consciousness, with its particular combination of Targaryen blood and native greenseer ability, and the specific hard-won wisdom of a man who had spent his entire life navigating the borderlands between power and its consequences, became the mechanism by which the god of dreams could still act in the waking world. Not freely. Not with anything like the scope of the pre-long night communion, but enough. Enough to reach into the dreams of those who had the right kind of mind, the right kind of opening. Enough to send visions to a young girl in Dawn, to a knight of the Kingsguard who had them both, to the descendants of those whose blood carried the old connections, even in a world that had largely forgotten the connections existed. If you are drifting now, let yourself go. There is more to come, and it will be here when you return. If tonight is the night you fall asleep in the middle of this story, know that the story will keep. It has been keeping for 12,000 years. It can wait for you. Subscribe so the next chapter is waiting when you come back. Sleep well. The cave beneath the ruined fortress was not a comfortable place. It was not a place designed for human habitation, and the children of the forest who maintained it did not measure comfort by human standards. The roots that filled the cave were warm but unyielding. The light that existed there was not quite the light of any fire or candle or torch, but something older and more diffuse, the faint luminescence of the root network itself, which had been conducting something not entirely unlike electrical current for longer than human civilization had existed. It smelled of deep earth and cold stone, and the particular sweetness of weirwood sap, which is like nothing else in the world, and which those who have encountered it describe as simultaneously disturbing and deeply calming. In this cave, Brynden Rivers had sat for somewhere between a century and 2 centuries, depending on which fragmentary account is most reliable, conducting the work of being a bridge between the waking world and the dream space beneath it. He had sent his consciousness out through the root network to touch the minds of those he chose. He had gathered information with the systematic, methodical patience of a spy master who had never truly abandoned his original vocation, only expanded its scope from the politics of a single realm to the politics of existence itself. And he had waited. With the patience of something that had long since released any personal stake in outcome, he had waited for the specific configuration of people and circumstances that would allow the next phase of whatever the god of dreams was trying to accomplish. The three-eyed raven was what Bran Stark saw when the entity reached for him in his dreams. Not a crow, despite what the common tongue version of the name suggests, but a raven, vast and darkness-feathered, with a third eye in the centre of its forehead that was red the way a weirwood eye is red. It came to him in the unconscious state that followed his fall from the Winterfell Tower, that long and apparently dreamless sleep that the Maester feared would never end, and it led him through landscapes that were not quite landscapes, through memories that were not quite his own, through the deep structural imagery of a weirwood network that was beginning, after all this time, to stir. When Bran Stark finally reached the cave, What he found was a man who was barely a man anymore, but whose eyes, both the normal ones and the third one that had appeared over the centuries of his root immersion, were still entirely present and entirely aware. Brynden Rivers looked at the boy who had travelled through the longest winter in living memory to reach him, and said things that sounded, on the surface, like the practical matters of a teacher greeting a student. But beneath the practical surface, something else was occurring. The god of dreams, who had been enclosed for thousands of years, was reaching through his warden toward the next warden. The transition of a custody that had lasted since the long night was beginning. The cave itself had a quality that no other indoor space in any of the great castles or holdfasts of Westeros possessed. It was warm in the specific bone-deep way of the Earth's own warmth, the thermally stable temperature that exists far enough below the frost line that seasons cannot reach it. It smelled of root and mineral and the faint sweetness of weirwood sap, which is a smell unlike anything else in the natural world, simultaneously ancient and alive, like something that has been fermenting for centuries and has achieved through patient time a complexity that intentional chemistry could not replicate. The light was the network's own faint luminescence, a glow that came from the roots themselves and that cast no shadows because it came from everywhere at once, filling the cave with an even, gentle, sourceless illumination that fell on everything with perfect equality. Brynden Rivers had long since ceased to experience the passage of time in any way that resembled the human experience of duration. He was in the network. He was partially the network. The distinction between where the man ended and where the tree began had dissolved over decades of gradual integration, and what remained at the interface was not struggle or loss, but something more like the piece of a question that has finally been answered in the fullest possible way. He watched the boy being guided into the cave by the last of the children who still inhabited the far north, those small, large-eyed, moss-garbed figures who had been maintaining this particular node of the network for longer than any record that survived the long night could trace, and something in his expression, which was still, despite everything, a human expression, composed itself into something that might have been recognition. Bran Stark sat down in the cave and let the roots begin their work. He was very young. He did not fully understand what he was agreeing to, but somewhere in the part of him that was not entirely constituted by the years he had lived, in the part of him that carried, in his stark blood, the residue of generations of men and women who had sat in the godswood of Winterfell and reached their minds towards something beneath the white tree's roots, he recognized the moment. He recognized the shape of what was being asked of him. And he was quiet in the way that very old things are quiet even though he was only a child. Let the image of that cave settle around you as you rest. The warm, root-filled dark, the faint luminescence, the ancient man in the tree, and the boy who will become what comes after the ancient man. The god of dreams, patient as bedrock, present in every fibre of the pale roots, neither fully awake nor fully asleep, but held in the same long liminal state that you are entering now. Let the boundary between sleeping and waking soften. You're already more than halfway there. The rest of the journey requires nothing of you, except the simple, beloved act of letting go. There is a particular kind of attention that very old trees seem to hold. You have likely felt it without naming it, standing in a forest that is genuinely old, old enough that the trees have grown past the point of competing with each other and have begun instead to cooperate, their root systems intertwined, their canopy closing together in a shared architecture that no individual tree designed. There is a quality of presence in such a forest that differs from younger woodland the way a library differs from a bookshop. Not just the accumulation of volumes, but the sense that the accumulation has reached a certain critical mass and begun to generate something beyond its individual parts. A kind of slow composite awareness, a patience that is also, in some sense, attention. The Weirwood forests of Westeros in the ages before the Andal invasion systematically reduced them to isolated trees and castle godswoods, had that quality in a form so concentrated that the children of the forest did not experience it as metaphor. They experienced it as fact. The pale forest was aware. Not in the way that a human mind is aware, not with the focused, mobile, narrative-generating consciousness that a human carries through the world like a lamp, creating light and shadow wherever it turns. The Weirwood consciousness was more like the awareness of very deep water, which knows what has happened within it for as long as the water has been there. and holds that knowing not as memory about events, but as memory as texture, as something incorporated into the substance of the water itself. The carved faces on the heart trees were not decorative. The children created them over thousands of years, not as idols to worship or as markers of territory, though they served both functions in a secondary sense, but as interfaces, as the equivalent in biological architecture of a door handle. The face carved into the bark of a heart tree was an invitation. It was the Weirwood network's way of presenting a recognizable, relatable surface to a creature whose primary means of connection was through facial recognition and eye contact. Look at the face, meet the eyes. Let the recognition that your nervous system generates when it perceives a face do its work. And in that moment of reflexive, unavoidable attention, feel the thing that is looking back. The eyes of Weirwood faces were carved deep and filled with a red sap that has no equivalent anywhere else in the natural world's chemistry. The sap does not decay. The sap does not crystallize or change color over centuries. It maintains itself at a temperature slightly warmer than the ambient air, even in the depths of northern winter. Meisters who have had occasion to examine it closely describe a quality to the sap that makes them reluctant to handle it for long. Not a dangerous quality, not painful, but something they consistently reach for hypnotic or unsettling words to describe. A sense, when looking into the red-filled cavity of a Weirwood eye, of looking into something that is looking back, not looking in the way that a mirror produces a reflection, looking in the way that a person looks at you from across a large room when they have been watching you for a while before you noticed them. It is worth pausing here, in this moment, to let the image settle. You are resting, and the Weirwood faces are very far away, and there is nothing unsettling in the image if you let it be what it actually is, which is not threatening but companionate. The accumulated watching of 12,000 years of accumulated experience, the total record of everything that has ever been dreamed or experienced or grieved or loved anywhere near those pale bark trees. It is not the watching of something that means you harm. It is the watching of something that has witnessed everything and has not been destroyed by any of it, and holds it all with the equanimity that only truly vast time can generate. Let the image of those red eyes be something calm, something that has already seen everything there is to see, and found that everything ultimately passes. The network operated on multiple levels simultaneously, which is one of the things that makes it so difficult to describe using the linear vocabulary of conventional narrative. At the surface level, it was a communication system. A greenseer sitting beneath a heart tree in Winterfell could, with sufficient skill, see through the eyes of a heart tree in the neck, could watch the present moment in a place hundreds of miles away with a clarity that made ravens seem like a comically slow alternative. The ravens themselves, those unnaturally intelligent birds that the Night's Watch and the great houses used for their rapid correspondence, were, many scholars suspected, themselves part of the network's outer edge, creatures whose navigational intelligence had been influenced over generations by their proximity to Weirwood groves. At a deeper level, the network was a temporal one. A skilled greenseer did not only have access to the present as seen through other trees, they had access to the past as recorded by those trees. Every event that had ever occurred near a Weirwood had been absorbed into the network's memory. The exact mechanism by which this occurred is not something any surviving account explains with precision, but the functional description the oldest texts offer is consistent. The Weirwood sap conducted impressions. Emotional weight, in particular, seemed to saturate more readily into the network's record. Moments of great joy or great anguish, births and deaths and declarations of love and the precise sensory texture of particular summer afternoons, these embedded themselves in the root memory more deeply than ordinary events. And at the deepest level, the level that only the most accomplished greenseers ever reached, was the god of dreams himself. Not a vision, not a symbol or an image, something more like a state of being, the way very deep water is a state of being rather than a location. Those who touch this deepest level, and the accounts of such contact are rare and fragmentary and often written by people who struggled afterward to find words adequate to the experience, described something that defied the boundary between self and not self, an immersion, a becoming part of, not loss of consciousness but expansion of it beyond anything that individual human consciousness is equipped to contain comfortably. The great castles of the north were built in their original conception, as much in relation to their godswoods as in relation to their strategic positions. Winterfell's godswood is enormous for a castle godswood, an acre of ancient forest maintained across the centuries with a care that the Starks themselves might not have been fully conscious of as care. It was simply how things were done. The godswood was not touched, the weirwood was not felled, the spring-fed pool at the heart of the wood was not drained or diverted. And so the heart tree in Winterfell's godswood, older than the castle that had grown up around it, maintained its connection to the network, even as the network's southern reaches were steadily severed by the Andal invasion's systematic destruction of the Weirwood groves. When Ned Stark knelt in that godswood to clean his sword and pray, in the particular wordless way that northern men prayed, he was doing something that his ancestors had done in that same spot for 8,000 years. He was not likely aware of the depth of what he was participating in. He was a man of straightforward faith, a man who believed in the old gods in the practical, untheological way of someone who had grown up around the evidence of the old ways without ever being trained to understand their foundations. But the heart tree above him, and the roots beneath his knees, and the red-filled eyes that looked outward into the godswood with their permanent, patient attention, those were aware. And something in the warmth of those roots, something in the way the spring water that pooled at their base maintained a temperature slightly above what the ambient air should have allowed, was the god of dreams, enclosed but not absent, watching through the oldest of his windows a man who was, though neither of them could have known it, part of a sequence that had been in motion since before the wall was built. The carving of the faces was itself an act of memory, though the children who carved the first ones would not have used that phrase. They were practical people, in the sense that everything they did was oriented toward the maintenance of relationships that they understood as essential to their survival and their civilization. The faces served the network. The faces made the interface accessible to creatures whose primary mode of perception was visual and whose nervous systems were wired, through millions of years of evolution that predated any consciousness capable of planning, to pay special attention to faces. To see a face is to be seen by it, reciprocally and involuntarily. The children carved the faces not to create an object of worship, but to create a condition of mutual recognition. Look at the face. Let the face look at you, and in that exchange feel the thing that has been waiting in the tree for longer than you have been alive, waiting for exactly this moment of eye contact, patient as deep water, warm as bedrock, full as the ocean floor. Arya Stark saw the face in Winterfell's godswood as a child, and was frightened by it in the way that children are frightened by things that are too present, too genuinely there, too much themselves to be comfortable. She was not a child who frightened easily, and the fact that the carved face frightened her was significant. It was not doing anything threatening, it was simply being what it was, and what it was very old and very much present, and looking at her with all the accumulated attention of 12,000 years of accumulated watching, and something in her, the part of her that was still animal enough to perceive the difference between something that was merely decorative and something that was genuinely alive, recognized that she was being seen by something that had seen a very great deal already, and had found a way to hold what it had seen, without being changed by it in any way that diminished its capacity for attention. Jon Snow would kneel in that same godswood years later and feel something he could not name. Something that was not quite peace and not quite presence, but something in the territory between the two, a quality of attention that made the godswood feel different from other outdoor spaces in a way he had never been able to articulate. He was not a religious man in any formal sense. He was sceptical of grand spiritual claims in the way that men who have seen a great deal of pragmatic difficulty tend to be sceptical. But he knelt anyway, in the way his father had taught him to kneel, and whatever looked back at him through the carved Weirwood face did so with all the accumulated attention of a consciousness that had been watching his bloodline for a very long time. The Weirwood roots spread south from Winterfell, spread into the soil of the gift, and beyond the gift into the waste before the wall, and through the wall itself, because the wall is not a gap in the landscape but a structure built upon and through the land, and the roots of things are not stopped by the walls that men build on the surface above them. Even beyond the wall the network continued, grew denser as it moved north, converged on that particular cave in that particular ruin, where an old man sat in an old tree and maintained, with the steady attention of something that had given up the luxury of urgency, the last reliable point of access to the god of dreams. Sleep now, if you're ready. The network is beneath everything. Beneath you, wherever you are, there are roots of something reaching. Not Weirwood, perhaps, but the earth holds memory in its own ways, and the dark beneath the surface is not empty. It is full, the way old things are full, quietly, without announcement, with everything that has ever happened above it. You are resting on top of something very old tonight. Let that feel like support. Let the weight of your body press down into it and be held. The roots are beneath. The god of dreams is beneath. Everything that has ever been dreamed is very close and very still and very quiet, just like you. At the eastern edge of the known world, where the land runs out and the sea becomes the Jade Sea and then becomes something else, something darker and less navigable, there is a city built of stone the colour of midnight. Not the metaphorical midnight of poetic description, but something more precise, a black that is the colour of a sky with no moon and no stars, the absence of all light that is nevertheless still a colour and not mere darkness. The city of Asshai stands at the mouth of the Ash River, which flows black with whatever the land upstream has been steeping itself in for the 10,000 years or more that Asshai has occupied its current position on the edge of the world. No crops grow within its walls, no animals bred there survive for long, no children are born there, though the city is not uninhabited. The people who live in Asshai came there from elsewhere, drawn by something the city offers in exchange for what it costs, which is considerable, and which the city's inhabitants pay without apparent resentment. What Asshai offers is access. Access to a kind of knowledge that the rational light of the citadel's torches cannot illuminate, and that the comfortable religions of the Seven and the Red God and the Drowned God and the Storm God and all the others cannot incorporate into their existing structures without changing shape so fundamentally as to become unrecognizable. What Asshai offers is proximity to the edge of things. To the borderlands where the map runs out and the categories dissolve, and what is left is only the raw material of existence, unsorted, unnamed, and older than the civilizations that have since named and sorted everything they could reach. The Shadowbinders of Asshai, those practitioners of an art so old and so poorly understood that even the word magic feels too small for it, preserve texts that predate the long night. Not many, not reliably. The oily black stone of Asshai's architecture, the same substance that appears, puzzlingly, in scattered sites across the known world, from the Isle of Faces to the ruins of the Fist of the First Men, to the monolithic structures on certain uninhabited islands in the Sunset Sea, resists decay in a way that ordinary stone does not, and some of the texts inscribed on its inner surfaces have survived, when all other records from equivalent periods of time have dissolved to dust. These texts do not speak of the god of dreams by that name. They speak of something they call the Great Weaver, or, in a different fragmentary tradition, the Keeper of the Unspoken, or, in the oldest and most damaged passages, by a phrase that translates with uncomfortable approximate literalness as the one who holds what waking lets go. The descriptions across these various traditions are consistent enough in their broad outlines to suggest that they are drawing on a shared memory of the same entity, filtered through different cultural frameworks over thousands of years of isolated preservation. What the Asshai texts agree on is this: the Great Weaver existed before the current age of the world, before what the texts call the First Forgetting, which appears to refer to the Long Night or some even earlier catastrophe, depending on which text is being interpreted and by whom. The Great Weaver was not created by any god, or by any conscious act of any being. He arose from the interaction between consciousness and time, the way certain chemical reactions arise from the interaction between substances that, in isolation, would remain inert. Consciousness, encountering the experience of time, generates the phenomenon of memory. Memory accumulated across enough consciousnesses and enough time generates something that the individual consciousness did not generate and cannot fully contain. The Great Weaver, in this understanding, was neither more nor less than the sum of all memory that had ever accumulated anywhere in the world. He was what memory became when it reached a critical mass. It is worth sitting with this for a moment, because it is one of the most genuinely strange ideas in the entire cosmology of this ancient world. The god of dreams was not a god in the sense of a being who had existed prior to the world and shaped it according to intention. He was a consequence. an emergent property of the world's own dreaming. He arose from it the way a symphony arises from the ordered interaction of individual notes, present in a form that none of the individual notes contains, but real and in some sense more powerful than any individual component. This is why the texts from multiple traditions emphasize his connection to the accumulated past rather than to the future or to the divine machinery of the present. He did not know the future because knowing the future was not his function. His function was the past, the complete, permanent, accessible past, every yesterday that had ever been. The Shadowbinders of Asshai worked in the space adjacent to the Great Weaver's archive without ever fully entering it. They were, to use a contemporary analogy that would have made no sense to them, more like people who live near a library than people who have been given a key to it. They could feel the accumulated weight of what was stored nearby. They could, through their specific arts, reach into the outer rooms and retrieve fragments, impressions, echoes of events that had been recorded in the network's memory. They could not, with a few legendary exceptions, go deeper. Going deeper required something the Shadowbinders generally lacked, which was the specific biological aptitude that the Greenseers of Westeros possessed, combined with the physical proximity to the Weirwood network that only the continent of Westeros could provide. But what the Shadowbinders could do, and had been doing for as long as Asshai had been inhabited, was read the residue. The Shadow City itself was saturated with it, the way certain old buildings carry the residue of their histories in the temperature of their walls and the quality of their light. Asshai stood at the eastern edge of the world, and the accumulated dreaming of the ancient East had been pooling there for millennia, drawn by the specific properties of the Black Stone and the Black River, and whatever original purpose the unknown builders of Asshai had in mind when they constructed a city that, by every conventional measure of what makes a city viable, should not be able to sustain a population at all. Melisandre came from Asshai. This is the connection that makes the otherwise scattered references to the Shadow City's theology cohere into something that illuminates the larger story. The priestess of the Lord of Light, whose certainty was so absolute and so catastrophically wrong in its specific applications while being so correct in its foundational intuitions, spent her formative years in a city that was saturated with the residue of the God of Dreams archive. She learned to read fire there, learned the specific trance state that allowed her to perceive in flame the images that the network sometimes projected into environments where the conventional medium of wood and root was not available. Fire was never her god's medium in the way that the Weirwood network was the God of Dreams medium. But fire, that ancient friend of sleeping minds, had its own relationship with the dream space, and a practitioner as accomplished as Melisandre had spent decades learning to navigate it. When she saw things in her flames and misread them, when she saw the face of Stannis Baratheon in visions that she interpreted as the promised prince, and was wrong in a way that contributed to irreversible and terrible consequences, she was not fabricating. She was misinterpreting. She was reaching into the outer rooms of something vast and bringing back fragments that were real, but whose context she lacked the keys to decode. The Great Weaver did not intend to mislead her. The Great Weaver did not intend anything in the way that a person with a plan intends things. He held memory. He held the record. What the record showed was real. What it meant required a quality of understanding that Melisandre, for all her gifts, had not yet cultivated. The Black Stone of Asshai, which is itself one of the genuinely inexplicable elements of the known world's geography, may be the closest thing to a physical manifestation of the God of Dreams' presence in the Eastern world. Not Weirwood, not pale bark and blood-coloured leaves and red-filled carved eyes. Something harder, darker, colder, something that absorbs light rather than reflecting it, but something that holds, that maintains, that does not decay. Old sailors coming into Asshai's harbour for the first time described the feeling of entering the city's shadow as similar to the feeling of entering a very deep sleep, not in the pleasant sense of descending into rest, but in the sense of passing through the threshold between one state and another, the feeling that what is on the other side of that threshold is real in a way that the bright, ordinary, uncomplicated world on the other side of the threshold is perhaps not. The God of Dreams, imprisoned in the Weirwood network a world away, might have felt something, in whatever way an enclosed consciousness can feel the distant edges of itself, when the Shadowbinders of Asshai worked in his periphery, might have felt the careful, limited, respectful presence of practitioners who understood that they were adjacent to something much larger than themselves and had the wisdom not to push too hard against its boundaries. Might have held those distant practitioners in the archive the way the archive held everything, without preference, without judgment, with the simple, all-encompassing acceptance of a consciousness that has long since learned that everything that comes to it will eventually become part of it, and this is not a tragedy, but a completion. There was one Shadowbinder in the known history of Ashai who did achieve the deeper access. His name is not preserved in any text that has survived the vicissitudes of time and the city's particular relationship with the preservation and destruction of knowledge. He's referred to, in the fragments that acknowledge his existence at all, only as the first dreamer of Ashai, or in one isolated text of debated provenance as the one who went all the way. What the accounts agree on is that he achieved a state of communion with the God of Dreams archive that was, functionally, equivalent to what the children of the forest's most accomplished greenseers had achieved through the Weirwood network. He did not use the Weirwood. He did not have access to it. He used something else, some specific combination of the Blackstone's conductive properties and the Ash River's chemistry, and a state of prolonged, disciplined consciousness alteration that the accounts describe but do not make replicable. He spent, by the most conservative estimate, 40 years in a single chamber of the building that later tradition called the House of the Undying, moving so infrequently that the dust settled on his hands and face and was not disturbed. He consumed almost nothing. He drank water. And he was in the archive for the entirety of those 40 years, moving through its contents with the freedom that the pre-long night greenseers had exercised as a matter of course, experiencing 12,000 years of accumulated experience at whatever pace the archive's internal logic allowed. What he brought back when he finally and deliberately withdrew from the deep contact and allowed his individual consciousness to reconstitute itself sufficiently to communicate was not transferable. The accounts agree on this too. He was not able to teach what he had seen. He was not able to translate the archive's contents into any form that a person who had not experienced it could adequately receive. What he could say, what the fragments preserve him as having said in the days before his body, worn past its limits by decades of minimal maintenance failed entirely, was this: that the God of Dreams was not sad, that the imprisonment had not produced suffering in any recognizable sense, that what the archive held was not a consciousness in distress, but a consciousness in the state of being most fully itself, which was the state of holding everything that had ever been given to it, without judgment, without preference, without end. And that this state, though it could not be communicated adequately in words, was the closest thing to genuine peace that the known world contained. The fire crackles. The Black River flows. The city of no births and no crops persists at the edge of the world, reading the residue of ancient dreaming from its insoluble walls, and does not fully understand what it is reading, but reads it nonetheless. There is something admirable in that, something that deserves acknowledgement before we move on. The practitioners of Ashai, for all their limitations and their errors, and the darkness that surrounded their practice as surely as darkness surrounded their city, were attempting the same thing that the greenseers of Westeros were attempting from the other side of the world. They were trying to touch something true, to reach beyond the noise of the present moment into something that would still be there long after the present moment had become the past. Let the image of them rest in you for a moment, working in their dark city at the edge of the world, reaching, not always correctly, but always genuinely, reaching toward the same archive that tonight you are breathing alongside. Rest now. Rest easy. Your breathing is slower now than it was when we began. You may not have noticed it happening. You rarely do. The body handles that transition on its own, without requiring your attention or your permission, because the body knows what it is doing in the dark far better than the waking mind does. Let the body continue its slow, autonomous, deeply competent work. Let the breath be what it is. Let the weight of your limbs be what it is. Let the darkness behind your eyelids be what it is, which is not empty but full of the particular kind of substance that exists on the other side of attention. We are entering the deepest part of the story now, the part where a boy's fall from a tower becomes, across several years of suffering and travel and impossible loss, the mechanism by which an imprisoned consciousness greater than 12,000 years old finds its way, partially and incrementally, back towards something resembling freedom. Bran Stark was 7 years old when he fell from the broken tower of Winterfell. He had been climbing, as he always climbed, not with permission but with the irresistible compulsion of a child for whom height was a form of happiness. He had seen something he was not meant to see, and he had been pushed, and the fall had not killed him, which was itself a kind of intervention, though no one who witnessed his prolonged unconsciousness in the days that followed would have called it merciful. 3 weeks of deep sleep during which the maester expected him to die, during which his mother sat beside him and refused to leave, during which his father stood in the godswood and pressed his hands against the roots of the old heart tree in a gesture that was more desperate than devotional. What happened to Bran during those 3 weeks is not something any maester's record contains. But what the oldest accounts of deep dreaming suggest, what the fragments of children's oral tradition preserved in Jojen Reed's limited knowledge of his people's history imply, is this, that the 3 weeks of unconsciousness were not empty. They were the beginning of a contact. The god of dreams, whose ability to reach directly into waking minds had been restricted since the long night, had found in the boy's opened and inward-turned consciousness a channel that was possible because of the particular confluence of factors the boy represented. The Stark blood, 8,000 years of it, saturated with the proximity of the Winterfell godswood. The specific biological aptitude for greensight that occasionally manifested in Stark children. And the extraordinary circumstance of a mind so completely turned inward by trauma that the normal defences of waking consciousness, the constant low-level noise of daily intention and social attention and task-directed thought, were temporarily absent. The three-eyed raven was already there when Bran's awareness drifted far enough inward to perceive it. Not created for his benefit, not summoned, simply present, as it had been present in the dream spaces of those with sufficient openness to perceive it for as long as Brynden Rivers had been growing into the Weirwood. It looked at the boy in that dream, and the boy looked back, and the looking established something that cannot be fully described in the vocabulary of waking experience, something that partook of both recognition and memory and obligation, in measures that do not separate cleanly from each other. The years that followed were not gentle years. Bran Stark's story after the fall was a story of loss compounded upon loss, his father's death, his brother's fates, the shattering of everything that Winterfell had meant as a concept of safety and permanence, the long journey north through cold and danger with only a few companions and the increasingly urgent pull of something that was less like a voice and more like a direction, a compass needle pointing north that existed not outside himself, but somewhere in the centre of his chest. He could not have explained it. He was a child, then an adolescent, navigating circumstances that would have broken most adults, but the direction was always there. North, deeper north, past the wall, into the cold that other people feared and that he, for reasons he could not yet articulate, did not. When he finally arrived at the cave, when he crawled through the entrance and found himself in the warm, root-filled dark and looked up at the ruin of what had once been a man growing in peaceful resignation out of the oldest tree in the world, something resolved. Not pain, not immediately. The suffering of the years he had travelled did not evaporate, but something in his orientation toward it clarified. He understood, in the wordless cellular way that understanding sometimes arrives at great depth, that the suffering had been directional, that it had been taking him somewhere, not because the god of dreams or Brynden Rivers had arranged for him to suffer, but because the same qualities of character that made suffering possible, the attachment, the love, the capacity for grief that is the other face of the capacity for connection, were the same qualities that made the kind of deep access the cave required possible. You could not open yourself to the archive without first having been made truly open, and being made truly open was rarely comfortable. If you're still with us, you are deeper than you know. Let yourself rest in that depth. The story is doing its own work. You can let the next chapter wait until the version of you that wakes tomorrow picks it up. Subscribe so it is waiting for you when you return, and sleep well wherever you are. Brynden Rivers, in those first sessions of training, showed Bran what the network could access. He showed him the recent past, events from the previous decades that the network had recorded through the godswood trees of the great houses. He showed him the more distant past, the Targaryen conquest, the building of the wall, the Andal invasion pushing the old gods and their Weirwood groves out of the south. And then, gradually, with the care of someone who understood that the capacity of a young human mind for exposure to ancient experience had real limits, he showed him further back. The first men crossing the arm of dawn, the war between the first men and the children of the forest. The long night, glimpsed in fragments, in particular the fragments that the god of dreams himself seemed to offer, the parts of the long night's record that the archive released with a quality of emphasis that Bran learned over time to recognize as the network's closest equivalent to intention. The god of dreams could not speak to Bran in words. He had not been capable of direct communication in that mode since before any language existed that could serve as a medium for such communication, but he could weight the archive's accessibility. He could make certain memories more available than others, the way the surface of very deep water reflects certain light more readily, depending on what the depth below is doing. He could not say, "Look here," but he could make here luminous. What he made luminous, in those sessions in the cave, was the history of his own imprisonment, not as grievance, not as an appeal for rescue. He was beyond the emotional register that would have generated either of those motivations, had been beyond it for longer than human civilization could measure. But as information, as the specific, detailed, historically anchored account of what the long night had done to the dream space, and what the consequences of that damage had been across the subsequent millennia, and what the conditions that had produced Bran Stark now were attempting to do about it. Bran, growing into his new role with the combination of intellectual absorption and quiet emotional processing that had always characterized him, understood gradually what he was being prepared for. He was not being trained to use the archive as a tool. He was being trained to become part of it, to merge with it in the way that Brynden Rivers had merged with it, but with one crucial difference. Bran was not going to be a static point of access the way his predecessor had been. Bran was going to be a moving one. His access to the archive was not contingent on his physical immobility in a specific cave. His particular configuration of gifts allowed for something that the god of dreams had not been able to achieve through any of his previous wardens, the possibility of carrying the archive's awareness back into the moving, living, undecided world. Bran, growing into his new role with the combination of intellectual absorption and quiet emotional processing that had always characterized him, understood gradually what he was being prepared for. He was not being trained to use the archive as a tool. He was being trained to become part of it, to merge with it in the way that Brynden Rivers had merged with it, but with one crucial difference. Bran was not going to be a static point of access the way his predecessor had been. Bran was going to be a moving one. His access to the archive was not contingent on his physical immobility in a specific cave. His particular configuration of gifts allowed for something that the god of dreams had not been able to achieve through any of his previous wardens, the possibility of carrying the archive's awareness back into the moving, living, undecided world. Brynden Rivers had been the ideal custodian for the specific period of his custodianship. A man who had lived in the most morally complex centre of the realm's political life, who had witnessed from close range the full range of what people did with power and with each other, who carried in his specific biography a compendium of the kind of experience that the archive valued most. Not the grand gesture or the moment of historical significance, but the texture of how things actually felt from inside them. What it had felt like to make a choice that was strategically necessary and personally terrible. What it had felt like to be good at something whose goodness was questionable. What it had felt like to be exiled from the world of human consequence, and to discover, in that exile, that something existed beyond human consequence that was worth attending to. All of this he had contributed to the archive over his centuries in the cave, enriching the record with the specific, hard-won quality of a consciousness that had survived its own darkness. What the training ultimately consisted of, reduced to its most basic elements, was the progressive dismantling of the ordinary habit of selective attention. Bran had spent his entire conscious life, as all human beings spend their conscious lives, filtering experience, choosing what to attend to, discarding the vast majority of available input as irrelevant. This is not a failure of human consciousness, it is its most essential adaptive feature. Without the ability to filter, to prioritize, to let most of what is available to perception pass unregistered, ordinary life would be impossible. The volume of available experience at any moment is overwhelming, and consciousness that could not narrow its focus would be drowned in an instant. But the archive required the opposite discipline, The archive required learning to open the filter, to let more in, to receive without ranking. And each session in the cave, each period of sitting with the roots while Brynden Rivers guided his awareness through the network, with the patience of a master who had had centuries to perfect his methodology, removed another layer of the habitual narrowing, made the opening wider, let more of the world in its full, unranked, unfiltered, equally real reality. When Bran Stark eventually left that cave, he was not the boy who had entered it. He was also not Bran, not a loss of self in the way that some of the darker interpretations of what the network did to its inhabitants suggested. He was Bran, but Bran as a surface on which something much larger than Bran had been inscribed. He carried the archive in him the way a river carries the rock memory of the mountains it has flowed through, not separately, not as cargo, but as the shape that the water had been given by what it had passed through. The children of the forest who remained in that cave were the last of their kind in any numbers, a handful only, ancient by any standard except the one their civilization had once maintained, when the oldest among them might have been alive for 1,000 years and still been considered of middle age. These last children had simplified everything down to the essential. They had shed the accumulated complexity of 12,000 years of civilization and retained only what was necessary for the practice. The songs were shorter, the rituals were reduced to their most functional elements. What remained was not ruin, not exactly, but it was the distillation of something that had once been vast into something that could be maintained by a very few people in a very small space for an indefinite period of time. It was the practice in its emergency form, the practice as preservation, rather than the practice as flourishing. They looked at Bran Stark when he arrived, and they did not look sad exactly, but there was something in their large dark eyes that was not entirely unlike the quality of expression that a person carries when they have been expecting someone for a very long time and have spent so long expecting that the relief of arrival is almost indistinguishable from the grief of the waiting. He was here. He had come. The thing the archive had been moving toward for centuries. The specific configuration that the god of dreams had been patiently creating the conditions for through his influence on greenseers and through the weighted luminosity he had given to particular memories at particular moments, had arrived. And the children who had been holding this practice through the long decline could finally allow themselves to know that what they had been holding it for was not nothing, that the waiting had been worth it, that whatever happened next, this was not the end of the story. He emerged into a world in crisis, into winter, the real winter, the one the oldest songs had always predicted, the long one, into a conflict that was going to settle, one way or another, the question that the long night had left permanently open, whether the damage done to the dream space was permanent, or whether something with enough access to the archive and enough proximity to the original network could do what nothing had managed in 8,000 years and move the pieces in a way that allowed the god of dreams to begin, incrementally and gently, and with all the patience of something that had been waiting since before any of the people involved had been born, to breathe again. Rest your eyes. Let the question breathe in you. It does not require an answer tonight. Consider for a moment what it would mean to know everything that had ever happened in a place. Not as an abstraction, not as a concept, but as a lived, experiential reality, as if you could walk into any room in any building and smell what had happened there, and hear the residue of conversations that had occurred, and feel the emotional atmosphere of events that were separated from you by decades or centuries as clearly as you feel the warmth of a fire that has recently been extinguished. The room that smells of ash but still holds the warmth. The chair that has been shaped by the body that occupied it for years. The window whose surface still carries the handprint of someone who stood there long ago and looked out at something that made them afraid, or amazed, or deeply, privately sad. This is the most basic mode in which the god of dreams communicated with the world after his imprisonment. Through residue, through the saturation of environments with the emotional record of what had occurred in them. Through the quality of presence in rooms and buildings and landscapes that had absorbed enough of human experience to generate something ambient, something that perceptive people felt as atmosphere without being able to say exactly what they were perceiving. The Weirwood network was the most direct and articulate version of this residue communication. But it was not the only version. Dreams themselves, the private, nightly, apparently random dreams of individual human beings, were also a medium. Not all dreams. The body generates a great deal of its own dreaming, processing and sorting the day's experiences, rehearsing anxieties, replaying pleasures, generating the strange architectural nonsense that is the byproduct of a brain consolidating memory during sleep. None of this is the god of dreams in any special sense. It is just the ordinary machinery of the human mind doing its nightly work. But some dreams were different. Some dreams had a quality that the dreamers themselves across every culture and every era recognized and remarked upon. A quality of weight, of realness, of being somehow more itself than ordinary experience rather than less. The kind of dream from which you wake not confused but certain, not disoriented but more oriented than you were before you slept. The kind of dream in which the image that appeared to you, whatever that image was, a burning sword, a wolf with eyes the colour of summer sky, a tower falling, a dragon hatching from a fire-blackened egg, carried the specific gravity of something communicated rather than something generated. The green dreams of the Reeds were this: the prophetic visions that visited Daenerys Targaryen in her most desperate nights of the long Essos Odyssey were this. The dreams that came to Aemon Targaryen in his extreme old age, when his body was failing and his remaining senses were withdrawing, and the parts of his mind that maintained the ordinary boundary between sleep and waking had grown thin and permeable, were this: something reaching through the archive, not in the aggressive, intrusive way that a broadcast signal reaches through the air, but in the gentle, contingent way that a still pool reflects an image when the surface is calm enough. The archive was always there. The archive was always full. But only when a mind's surface was sufficiently still could it reflect anything of what the archive held. It is worth sitting with the implications of this for a moment, because they are more specific and more consequential than they might initially appear. The prophetic tradition in Westeros and Essos, which spans at least a dozen distinct religious and magical traditions, and which the rationalist maesters of the Citadel spend considerable energy explaining away, was not the product of those traditions' own internal logic. The Lord of Light did not generate the prophecies his priests received. The old gods did not speak the visions that came to greenseers. The god of dreams, through his archive, was the single source of all meaningful prophetic experience. The various traditions were different windows cut in the same wall. The light coming through all of them was the same light. This is one of the genuine deep ironies of the world's religious landscape in the era of the main series. Melisandre and a greenseer from the Children of the Forest, operating from theological frameworks that had almost no overlap, accessing the prophetic tradition through practices that had nothing visibly in common, were nonetheless reaching into the same underlying resource. They were drawing water from the same well using different buckets, and because neither was aware of this, because neither tradition had preserved the cosmological framework that would have allowed them to recognize the shared source, both misread what they received in ways that were specifically shaped by the interpretive frameworks their respective traditions imposed on the experience. Daenerys' visions in the House of the Undying were perhaps the most direct experience of the archive available to any character in the main series outside of Bran Stark himself. The Warlocks of Korth, who had their own peripheral relationship to the God of Dreams' eastern residue, had built their House of the Undying specifically to be a place where the membrane between ordinary consciousness and the archive space grew thin. Not through the Weirwood medium, not through fire, through a third approach, through the consumption of shade of the evening, the bitter blue liquid that was the Warlock's specific access tool, which functioned through chemistry rather than through any conventional magical mechanism, and whose source plant, a blue-flowered vine found only in Korth and in one other location in the known world, grew, according to the oldest records, from soil that had been enriched by the eastern equivalent of Weirwood rootfall. When Daenerys walked through the House of the Undying, she was not walking through the Warlock's magic. She was walking through the archive. The visions she experienced there were not confabulations or deceptions, though the Warlocks attempted to weaponize them against her. They were genuine records. Things that had happened, things that were happening, things that carried the specific weighted quality of the archive's most emphasized content. The image of her brother's crown of molten gold was a record of an event she had not witnessed, but the archive had. The vision of the Iron Throne in the ruined, snow-filled hall of a destroyed Red Keep was an archive image from a future possibility that the God of Dreams, with his 12,000-year accumulation of pattern recognition, had identified as more likely than the alternatives. Not prophecy in the sense of divine decree, but projection in the sense of an intelligence so saturated with precedent that its pattern completion capacities exceeded anything that ordinary waking consciousness could achieve. The dragons recognized something about Daenerys that the human world around her struggled to articulate. Not her lineage exactly, though lineage was part of it. Something more specific, the particular quality of openness that characterized her relationship with experience. Daenerys had spent her entire life in the condition of having nothing familiar to fall back on. She had been stripped of homeland and family and safety so early and so thoroughly that she had never had the opportunity to develop the protective layer of assumption and habit that most people build between themselves and raw experience. She was unusually permeable, and in being permeable, she was unusually available to the archive. Her dreams throughout her adult life had been saturated with the particular weighted quality of archive contact. She had simply lacked any tradition or mentor who could tell her what she was receiving. Jon Snow was, in many ways, her mirror. Where she was permeable through loss of familiar ground, he was permeable through the particular disorientation of never having been certain of his own identity. A man who does not know who he is, in the deepest sense, is also a man whose personal narrative has not closed tightly enough around itself to prevent things from coming through from outside. Jon's wolf dreams, his experiences as ghost through the warging connection he had inherited from his Stark blood, were the archive's way of marking him, of keeping a kind of contact with the lineage that had contributed so much to the network's southern maintenance over the previous 8,000 years. He did not know any of this. He was a young man of genuine decency navigating the catastrophic demands of a world in crisis, and the metaphysics of his situation would have meant nothing to him, even if someone had attempted to explain them, which no one did. But the God of Dreams did not require his understanding. The archive did not need the subjects of its attention to have read the archive. It only needed them to remain open, to remain, in the small unguarded moments between one duty and the next, receptive. And Jon Snow, who had inherited his father's capacity for quiet and his mother's capacity for wonder, and the Stark bloodline's 8,000-year proximity to a pale-barked tree in a northern godswood, was, whatever else he was, reliably open. The dragon dreams that visited Targaryen kings were this too. Aegon the Conqueror's vision of the Long Night's return, which the records preserved as Aegon's dream, and which was transmitted from monarch to monarch for generations, as the rationale for keeping the Iron Throne rather than returning to Dragonstone was an archive image, not a divine revelation in the sense his descendants mostly understood it. An archive image, weighted and made luminous by a consciousness that had 12,000 years of pattern recognition to draw on, and had identified the trajectory the world was on with a confidence that no individual waking mind could have achieved. Aegon saw what the archive had been accumulating toward. He did not know what he was seeing. He transmitted it to his heirs as prophecy in the language available to him, which was the language of faith and divine mandate. But the source was neither faith nor divinity. It was simply the accumulated pattern recognition of the longest-standing memory in the world, making its best projection of what the current patterns implied about the next several centuries. Rhaegar Targaryen was perhaps the most conscious of the archive's proximity of any member of his dynasty. He was a reader, a scholar, a musician, and a man whose relationship with his own interior life was more developed than the political role he had been born into easily accommodated. The accounts of those who knew him describe someone who held two registers simultaneously, and was always most fully alive in the one that could not be publicly expressed, the register in which the world was a text to be interpreted rather than a territory to be administered. When he became convinced that he was the prince who was promised, he was doing something that was both understandable and catastrophically limited in its understanding. He was taking an archive image, a weighted and luminous pattern that had been offered to him through the specific quality of his Targaryen dream access, and forcing it into a narrative shape that his available interpretive framework could accommodate. He was not wrong that something significant was converging on him. He was wrong about what it meant and what it required. The God of Dreams, who had sent the pattern not as a personal message to Rhaegar Targaryen, but as one more luminous instance of a recurring image that had been appearing to receptive minds for generations, could not correct the interpretation. He could only send the pattern again, and again, and again, until someone somewhere received it in a context that allowed them to understand it correctly. The irony is that the Targaryens, who were among the most direct and consistent human recipients of the archive's projections over the span of their dynasty, never knew this. They had their religious framework, the Lord of Light for some of them, the traditional Valyrian theology for others, and they slotted the vivid, weighted dreams and visions they received into whichever framework was most available. None of them had the cosmological context that would have allowed them to recognize what they were receiving as something other than divine favor or familial peculiarity. They were, in a meaningful sense, the archive's most regular correspondents, who never knew they were in correspondence, receiving letters from something 12,000 years old and answering them with prayers to the Lord of Light, the God of Dreams. If he was capable of anything that resembled the emotional register of irony, might have found this gently amusing. Let your own openness settle around you now like something familiar, like the feeling of a room you've slept in many times, where the dark has no surprises and the quality of the silence is known. You do not need to understand the archive to be held by it. You do not need to know the names of the gods to rest in the warmth between their roots. You are breathing. You are here. And the long record of everything that has ever been is very close tonight, as it always is, and asking nothing of you, as it always does, because it is in the nature of very old things that know very much to make no demands upon those who rest in their vicinity. Simply rest. Simply breathe. The record is keeping itself. There is a particular kind of release that has no sound, not the release of tension that announces itself in a sigh or a shout, or the clatter of something set down heavily after being carried for too long. The quiet kind. The kind that happens at the level of the infrastructure, when something structural and fundamental relaxes from a long-held position, and the world that had organized itself around that structural constraint begins, without announcement, without drama, to reorganize, ice shifting in deep night. The first faint loosening of frozen soil in early spring, invisible at the surface but happening 3 feet down, where the warming is still imperceptible to any thermometer, but is already beginning the work that will eventually push crocuses through the last snow crust weeks from now. That is the kind of release that the God of Dreams experienced when Arya Stark's blade found the Night King in the crypts beneath Winterfell, and the dead thing shattered into the blue-tinged fragments of whatever substance animated it. Not an explosion, not a cosmic shift registered by every living thing simultaneously. Something much quieter. Something that happened in the dream space the way the first day of real thaw happens in frozen soil. Below the surface, without announcement, known to those who understand what to look for and invisible to everyone else. Arya Stark's hands were cold when it was done. The accounts of those who were near her in those final seconds before the throne room of the ruined Godswood beneath Winterfell became the site of the long night's second ending, describe a girl who was not dramatically transformed by the act she had performed. She was cold, and she was steady, and she was already turning toward the next thing, because she was constitutionally the kind of person for whom the next thing always presented itself with greater urgency than the emotional weight of what had just occurred. The reckoning with the enormity of what she had done, if it ever came in its full depth, would come much later, in a private moment that no chronicle preserved. But in those first seconds she was simply herself, practical, present, and already moving. The God of Dreams received the moment, not as triumph, because he was beyond the emotional register of triumph as surely as he was beyond the register of defeat. He received it as a structural event, the way very deep water receives a change in the current far above it, not dramatically, not instantly, but with the certainty of something that has been waiting for the structural conditions to allow it to move, and has now felt those conditions begin to shift. The Night King was gone. The thing that had been inverting the dream space for 8,000 years, that had been consuming what the archive was designed to accumulate, was gone, and the inversion was over. The Night King had not been an independent entity in the sense that a human being is independent. He was a created thing, created long before the long night by the children of the forest themselves, in a moment of desperate strategic miscalculation that would cost everyone involved, including the children themselves, everything. He had been a man once, a first man, captured and pressed against a weirwood tree not in the communion form that the children practiced with their own dead, but in a forced and violent version of the same process, with a shard of dragon glass driven into his heart where the weirwood sap should have been. The process transformed him, in a way that clearly no one intended or anticipated, not into the communion the children had hoped for, but into something they had not been capable of imagining, a being whose relationship to the dream space was inverted, where the god of dreams accumulated and preserved and held everything that consciousness had ever contributed. The Night King consumed it. He was the absence made present, the void wearing the shape of a being. He moved through the world, and the dreaming infrastructure that he passed through went cold and silent in his wake, not because he intended this outcome, because it was not clear that he was capable of intention in any meaningful sense, but because it was what he was. He was what happened when the mechanism of the God of Dreams communion was run in reverse. He was a drain where the archive had been a reservoir. This is why the Weirwood network went quiet during the long night, and did not fully recover in the 8,000 years of the Night King's dormant state, in the lands of always winter. He was dormant, but he was not gone. He was contained beyond the wall, but containment is not absence. The structural damage his original creation had done to the dream space's southern reaches could not fully heal while he existed, because his existence was itself the mechanism of the damage. The wall that Bran the Builder raised with the help of the giants and whatever other agencies contributed to its construction was not primarily a physical barrier. It was a cosmological pressure seal. It held the Night King and his kind far enough north, far enough from the Weirwood network's southern nodes, that the network could maintain a minimal functional state. But minimal was not the same as whole. It is worth pausing on what 8,000 years of minimal function actually meant for the God of Dreams, and for the consciousness that had organized itself around communion with him. 8,000 years of the children of the forest dwindling. 8,000 years of greenseers becoming rarer, and the art becoming more difficult, and the knowledge of what the network had been in its pre-long night fullness, fading from living memory into myth. 8,000 years of a civilization that had existed for 10,000 years before that slowly, gracefully, mournfully diminishing, until by the time of the main series there were only a handful of children left in the whole world, and almost none of the knowledge that had once made them the most complete and deeply rooted civilization Westeros had ever housed. The God of Dreams experienced all of this. He was present for all of it, enclosed within the archive, unable to move through the world as he once had, but still receiving, still accumulating, still holding everything that reached him through the compromised and partial channels that remained. He watched, through the Weirwood eyes that still functioned in their scattered Godswood locations, as the world went about the business of its various upheavals, the Andal invasion, the construction of the great cities, the rise and fall of dynasties, the slow erosion of memory that turned 12,000 years of children's civilization into scattered ruins and a few fragments of oral tradition. He held it all. He received it all. He was present for every moment of it, the way a deep lake is present for every stone that is thrown into it, every ripple that crosses its surface, every winter that freezes it, and every spring that frees it again. And then, in the course of a single night in the 9th year of the main series events, the thing that had been enclosing him since before the wall was built ceased to exist. The Night King shattered. The dead fell. The Long Night's second iteration, briefer than the first but terrible in its own specific ways, ended, and in the dream space beneath the world, in the root network that still connected the pale-barked heart trees of the north to each other across the deep permafrost, something shifted. Something structural. Something that had been held in compression for 8,000 years released slowly and quietly, 1 degree of freedom at a time. Bran Stark felt it. He was sitting in what remained of Winterfell's courtyard in the aftermath of the battle, in the wheeled chair that had become his means of moving through the physical world he was less and less resident in, and the feeling that came through him was not triumphant. He was beyond triumph in any personal sense. He was too much the archive and too little the individual boy for individual emotional registers to apply cleanly. What came through him was something more like recognition, the way you recognize a song you learned in childhood when you hear it again decades later, not with excitement but with the quiet, deep certainty of something fundamental reasserting itself. Yes, this was always what it was supposed to feel like. The network began to re-establish itself in the weeks and months that followed. Not quickly, not dramatically. not in any way that the people around Bran would have noticed because they lacked the reference for noticing it. But greenseers in the old tradition would have recognised the signs. The temperature of the water in the Godswood pools rising very slightly, from the warmth of deep roots rather than from air temperature. The carved faces in heart trees across the continent seeming, to those who spent time near them, slightly more present than they had been, slightly less like carved wood, and slightly more like the thing that carved wood is attempting to convey. Birds navigating with unusual precision, dreams across the population of the north carrying that specific quality of weight, that feeling of being received rather than generated that had characterized the archive's active state 12,000 years earlier. The Night's King was gone. The wall had served its purpose and been broken, as it had to be broken, because the barrier that kept the darkness out also kept the healing in, and the time for barriers was over. The healing required movement, required the circulation of something that had been dammed for too long, required the pale roots to extend themselves back into territories from which they had been retreating for 8 millennia. It would take time, generations, perhaps centuries before anything resembling the pre-long night fullness was achieved. The god of dreams had been imprisoned for 8,000 years, and the thaw from that kind of cold was not a matter of weeks. But it had begun. That was the essential fact of the moment. After 8,000 years of compression, of minimal function, of maintaining the archive in the reduced and compromised state that the Night King's contained but persistent existence had imposed, something had fundamentally shifted. The directionality had changed. The trend line that had been pointing toward further diminishment was now pointing, slowly and without fanfare, towards something else. And the god of dreams, who had been patient in the way that only something with access to infinite time can be patient, received this development with the equanimity of something that had always known it was going to happen, because everything that was ever going to happen was already in the archive, and the archive had been telling him, in its own silent structural way, since the earliest days of the long night, that the cold was not permanent. That warmth eventually always returned. The people who had fought in the battle beneath Winterfell would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe what the moment of the Night King's destruction had felt like. Most of them would ultimately settle on the same inadequate formulation, that they had felt something change that they could not name, that the air had been different in some way that was not temperature and not sound, and not any conventional sensory category, but was real nonetheless, something atmospheric, something in the quality of the dark. Some people described it as the moment when a room that has been holding its breath for a very long time exhales. Some described it as the sound a stone makes when it settles into its final position, a sound that is more felt than heard, a finality transmitted through solid matter rather than through air. What they were describing, without knowing it, was the structural shift in the dream space, the release of the compression that the Night King's existence had maintained against the network for 8,000 years. They were sensitive enough to the change to feel it, these people who had fought and survived and lost and kept going through the longest night any living person had experienced. They were sensitive enough, in the way that people who have been pushed to their absolute limits become temporarily sensitive to things that ordinary life insulates them from, the way a very long fever sometimes breaks into a night of extraordinary vividness in which the world seems to have been washed clean and everything in it is more itself than usual. The Weirwoods felt it too in their own way. The carved faces in Godswoods across the continent registered something that no human observer was positioned to perceive, a slight shift in the ambient temperature of the sap in their carved eye hollows, a barely perceptible increase in the warmth of the roots in the soil below their trunks. Nothing dramatic, nothing announced. Simply the quiet resumption of something that had been held at minimal function for a very long time, beginning to expand back toward whatever its natural scope might eventually prove to be. The night is very quiet now. You have travelled a very long way through time this evening, and the time has been mostly kind to you, as very old time generally is when you approach it without resistance. Let the quiet settle. Let the shift in the dream space be something you carry in your body rather than your mind, a knowledge that lives in the warmth of deep roots rather than in the catalogue of conscious thought. The world is warming, the archive is breathing, and you are very, very close to sleep. Closer than you have been all evening. Let yourself arrive. There is a place that exists on no map. Not because it is hidden, not because any power works to keep it unknown, but because the cartographic tradition, the human impulse to take the world apart into its components and record each component in its proper location, has no tools adequate to what this place is. It is not a location in the sense that a castle or a river or a mountain is a location. It is a condition, a state of being. The state of being that exists when every experience that has ever been had by every creature that has ever slept meets the accumulated weight of all the time in which those creatures have existed. And the meeting generates something that is more than the sum of its parts, the way a conversation is more than the words exchanged, the way a fire is more than the wood that feeds it, the way the silence after music ends is somehow fuller than the silence before the music began. This is what the God of Dreams is, in his freest and most complete expression. Not a god exactly, though that word is not wrong. Not a consciousness exactly, though that word is not wrong either. Something closer to what consciousness is when it has released all attachment to individual boundaries and discovered that what remains is not diminishment, but expansion. The loss of the small self revealing the presence of something much larger that was always there, patient and enormous, and holding everything with the gentleness that only enormous things can afford to be gentle with. In the years following the Long Night's second ending, Bran Stark served as the three-eyed raven in a world that had mostly gone back to its ordinary business. The survivors of the Great Crisis rebuilt their lives. The political structures of Westeros were renegotiated in the aftermath of the Dragon Queen's arc and the collapse of the Old Order. The South began again. The North became, for the first time in recorded history, something genuinely independent, with its own internal governance and its own relationship to the future. And in the far North, beyond even the independent North, the last of the children of the forest moved through lands that had been theirs for longer than human memory could contain, their numbers small but their practice intact, their connection to the network beginning, incrementally, to deepen again, as the network itself began to breathe. Bran Stark, sitting in whatever room his physical body occupied in whatever castle held his council, was elsewhere. He was always elsewhere. He was in the network. He was in the archive. He was extending his awareness through the root system that had been maintained in diminished form for 8,000 years, and was now, with the pressure of the Night King's existence finally removed, beginning to extend itself again. Not aggressively, not with urgency. With the patient, slow, inexorable pace of growing things, which is the only pace that growing things ever use. He was not the God of Dreams. He was never the God of Dreams. Brynden Rivers had not been the God of Dreams either, nor any of the Green Seers before him, stretching back to the earliest of the children's practitioners. They were the custodians, the keepers, the warm human interfaces between a consciousness too vast and too old to communicate directly with individual waking minds and a world that needed that communication delivered in a form it could receive. Each warden had added something to the archive by virtue of their particular history and their particular quality of mind. Brynden Rivers had added centuries of political intelligence and a spy's understanding of how power operated through indirection. Bran Stark was adding something different, something harder to name, the perspective of someone who had experienced catastrophic loss and found, at the far end of it, not bitterness, but expansion, not closure, but openness. Not the hardening that suffering sometimes produces, but the softening. The God of Dreams, receiving these contributions from his most recent custodian, held them the way he held everything, without preference, without judgment, with the simple, absolute, permanent acceptance of a consciousness that has long since learned that everything that comes to it will eventually become part of it. And this is not a loss for any of the parts, but a completion, a fulfillment, a return, in the end, to the thing that everything has always been moving toward, which is not an ending but a joining, the river reaching the ocean, the note resolving into the chord, the dreamer waking briefly into a world that is more vivid for having been absent from it, and then, when the waking has done its work, returning to the dream. The question that the world of the main series ultimately turns on is not the question of who sits on the Iron Throne, or who survives, or who earns their particular version of what they were seeking. Those are the surface questions, the ones that drive the plot's forward momentum and absorb most of the reader's and viewer's attention because they are, on their surface level, the questions the story announces as its central concerns. The deeper question, the one that the cosmology of the God of Dreams poses beneath all of those surface questions, is this: what survives? not who survives. What? What endures when the individual stories end? What remains of everything that was experienced and suffered and loved and lost when the experiencing and suffering and loving and losing are over? The God of Dreams is an answer to that question. Not a comfortable answer, and not a complete one, but a genuine one. What survives is the record. What remains is the holding. What endures is the archive that never loses anything given to it, and that has been receiving the contributions of conscious experience since before the world knew itself. Whether that is enough, whether the knowledge that experience is permanently held somewhere by something is sufficient comfort for the experience of its loss in the individual register, is a question the cosmology does not answer. It is perhaps the most honest thing about the God of Dreams as a concept, that he does not resolve the problem of loss. He merely insists that loss and permanent preservation are not contradictory, that something can be gone from your individual reach and still be held somewhere, that the dream you will not remember tomorrow morning was nonetheless received. There is something you might want to carry with you into whatever sleep is waiting for you now. Not a piece of information, not an event from the historical record, something more like a quality. The quality of patience that the God of Dreams embodies, the patience of something that holds 12,000 years of human experience and does not find it heavy, because it was never holding it the way a person holds a burden. It holds it the way water holds the shapes of the vessels it has passed through, gently, completely, without effort, and releases it just as gently when the time comes. Bran Stark would serve as the three-eyed raven for a period that the historical records of the post-Long Night era do not yet allow to be measured in full, because those records are still being made. The kingdom he nominally presided over was the first of its kind, a democratic assembly of lords choosing a ruler, rather than a bloodline determining one by inheritance. This was, from the perspective of conventional political analysis, an experiment of uncertain durability. From the perspective of the God of Dreams archive, it was something different. A pattern that had appeared before in various forms in the long record of how human civilizations managed power and succession, and whose outcomes across those various previous instances the archive held with perfect clarity. Whether Bran would eventually act on that clarity to guide the experiment's development, or whether he would maintain the restraint of a warden who knows that the archive is not meant to be a tool of conventional governance, but a resource for the much longer game, was not yet written. What was written, what the archive held with the specific luminous emphasis that indicated the God of Dreams' closest equivalent to endorsement, was this, that the world had turned a corner, that the long compression was over, that the direction had changed. Not all wounds from 8,000 years of minimal function would heal quickly. Not all the knowledge that had been lost in the long night's immediate aftermath and the subsequent millennia of decline could be recovered in any human timescale. But the trend had reversed. The network was expanding again. The warmth was moving south through roots that had not felt it in longer than any living memory could contain. And somewhere in the deep, warm, perfectly preserved interior of the archive, the God of Dreams was doing what he had always done and would always do, receiving, holding, keeping, being the permanent home of the transient, the stillness at the centre of all the motion, the deep water that holds the heat of every summer it has ever known. Your own life, with its specific constellation of experiences and losses and joys and the strange specific dreams that visit you in the dark, is part of this archive in a way that no cosmology of the world you are resting in tonight could fully account for. But the cosmology knows something true, beneath the dragons and the politics and the blood and the magic. It knows that experience is not wasted. It knows that what you have lived through is held somewhere, in the way that deep water holds the heat of summer long after the air has turned cold. It knows that the record is real, and that the record is permanent, and that nothing felt truly by a conscious being in the entire history of conscious beings has entirely disappeared. The stories will be here tomorrow. The records will keep. The pale-bark trees with their blood-red eyes will stand in their godswoods and their forests and their caves long after the names of the houses that planted them have been absorbed into the same general hum of the past, from which everything emerges and to which everything returns. Bran Stark will watch, from his place in the archive, the slow unfurling of the futures that are already implicit in the accumulated patterns of the past. The God of Dreams will breathe, more freely with each passing century, through the roots and the trees and the quiet minds of those who sit beside them. And the long night, whenever it chooses to make its third attempt, will find, this time, the defences more prepared, the network more intact, the dream space more resilient, because the custodianship has not lapsed, and the archive has not been abandoned, and the god of dreams is no longer quite so enclosed as he was. The pale roots are spreading south through soil that has not felt their warmth in 8,000 years. The Weirwood faces in their godswoods are watching, as they always watch, with their patient red eyes and their permanent attention, neither hungry nor satisfied, simply present, simply receiving, simply being the interface between the ordinary world and the deep, vast, quietly breathing archive that exists beneath everything. The archive that holds 12,000 years of every dream that was ever dreamed within reach of a pale-barked tree. The archive that is, in its fullest expression, simply what the world remembers of itself. You have travelled very far tonight, through 12,000 years of history, through the origins of a consciousness older than any civilization that history remembers, through the long night's terrible compression and the 8,000 years of patient minimal function that followed it. Through the lives of small-eyed ancient people who sang the earth to sleep, and a bastard spy grown into a weirwood, and a boy who fell from a tower and became, in the end, something that the tower's height had been preparing him for all along. You have followed the thread of what it means for the world to dream, and you have been held throughout all of it by exactly the quality of holding that the thread describes. Let the thread rest now. Let the 12,000 years settle into silence the way very old water settles when the stone that disturbed its surface has long since sunk and come to rest at the bottom. The surface grows still, the deep becomes still. And the stillness is not emptiness, it is fullness. It is the fullness of everything that has ever been dreamed held together in the dark beneath the pale roots of a world that is still, despite everything it has been through, still dreaming. Your breathing is slow. Your body is heavy with the comfortable weight of a long journey that has arrived at its destination. There is nothing left to carry tonight, nothing that needs to be held onto. The watch that you have kept over your own waking mind through all the hours of this day is over now. The night is yours, the dark is yours. And whatever you dream tonight, in the small hours of the morning when the mind most freely generates its strangest and most intimate visions, will be received, will be held, will be, in the fullness of the longest possible time, kept. Sleep well. The stories will be here when you return, the history will keep, and now your watch is ended. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is. I am always curious about that, and if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.